Now that we have textures and the model files running, we can actually have the sphere textures as well. We have a few selections of objects now, different objects that we can put into our scene. In this case here we have a sphere, we have the possibility of a textured cube, texture mapped in different ways, and our object file, our loaded object files. So now I want to look at blending and the alpha value a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back here into the display function and look at this piece of code a little bit. So let's just uncomment that and see what everything does. This simply says OpenGL should do blending. So we're simply switching on blending. And what blending is that every time something has gone through the OpenGL pipeline, it leaves some color in the frame buffer. And when we clear, like here, we simply set our clear color, which in our case now is black, set that into every pixel in the frame buffer. And what blending does is it tells OpenGL when we're going to put a new pixel into the frame buffer. We don't want to just overwrite what's already there. We want to take what's already there and multiply that with some factor. Take the new value that we're going to put in, multiply that with some factor, add the two together, and put that into the frame buffer. So we're going to mix the color that's already there with the color that we're putting in. Blend func tells OpenGL which factors this should be. So this is what will be multiplied with the new color that we're putting in there, which is called source, the source color. This is what will be multiplied with the destination color. So we're going to use the source alpha, the alpha value of the source color that we're putting in there, multiply that with the source. We're going to take 1 minus that source, so kind of the rest in a weighted average, and multiply that with what's already there. But we can put any of these factors into either one of these positions here in the function, but this thing, GL source alpha and 1 minus source alpha, is kind of a way to do traditional transparency. However, once we run this, pretty much nothing will happen. It just looks exactly the same, because the alpha value of everything is 1. So if we go into our shader here, I'm going to go right to the bottom of the shader and uncomment this line here. What I'm doing, I'm simply setting the fourth value to 0.5, the fourth value of the color. So the color is a vec4. The first one is red, then green, then blue, then alpha, or X, Y, Z, and W. And we can index into this in any way. So A is simply saying, it's basically the same thing as saying this. So the fourth color, the fourth value here. No, dot alpha. And let's see how this looks now. Okay, suddenly it's a little bit different. You can see through these things, but we can't see through everything in all directions. It kind of changes. And that has to do with the order in which we draw things. Because if we want something to be seen through what we're drawing now, the thing that's behind it, and we want to be seen through the transparency, needs to be drawn first. Because when we draw the transparent object, we're mixing it with what's already in the frame buffer. If the thing we want to mix with hasn't been put in the frame buffer already, it won't be there. So transparent objects need to be drawn last, and they need to be drawn in the order from farthest to nearest. We can look at that better later on if we kind of play around with these different factors here. So if we go back to here, you say, okay, this is one way of doing it. Another way is to say I'm just going to take the color and I'm going to add it to the color. So 1 times this color plus 1 times this color. No attenuation. Alpha value doesn't even matter here. And this is what we get. But still, you can see here, only the lower floors of this pyramid are being mixed through. If I go higher, then I see this lower floor here as well. And the reason for this is because of the order in which these are drawn. So I can see if I go through this in this direction here, I don't see the one behind until I'm already through this. If I, however, look around and do the same thing in the other direction, I can always see them. It's still there when I go through. When I do it in this direction, it's because of the order in which they're drawn. So we have to draw the thing that is closer to us later. However, we can do another thing. We can simply say, well, if we don't have any depth test, then we're just always adding and mixing. So I'm going to disable the depth test and see what happens then. Now everything is mixed with everything in any order. So it doesn't matter where I'm coming through. However, now it's insanely bright. So then we might want to do something like, we're just going to add it, but we're going to add it using the alpha. So we're not going to add it using its full value, but using a lower value. So this is nice. Everything can be seen through everything else. Kind of disappears when it's in front of something. And then we can go back in here and set the alpha value lower. Just kind of see what happens. You can play around with this and you can use textures and sprites and stuff. Everything's a bit dark, but as soon as it starts adding up, you get these cool light effects where all the colors are adding up through this blending. So this isn't normal transparency, but you can make really cool effects with this by just turning off the depth test. But obviously, if we now take blending off, so comment the blending out again, but disable the depth test, it's going to give us all sorts of weird. So now we're drawing solid objects, but we're not checking which one is in front of another, and everything is just absolutely strange. So let's enable the depth test again and the blending. Use this regular transparency blending here. Let's see what more we can do with this. So using this, so source alpha 1 minus source alpha. We have the depth test on. Okay, so it's only where I get the specularity, which is added on top here. It starts kind of adding up like this. So okay. However, what we're doing now is we're just setting the alpha here. So we'd really want alpha to be part of the material. You don't want to just set this to. So what we can do instead, we can go ahead and say, well, let's say material diffuse dot a. So we're using the actual diffuse value of the material. So okay, now everything is 1. Now I'm going to go into my code and say, well, in that case, I can go ahead and say I'm setting the color here for each pyramid, for instance. And let's just say that I'm going to set for one of the pyramids a very low alpha, for the other one a fairly high alpha, but still not completely 1. But the diffuse alpha for the sphere is 1, so that'll be completely solid. I can see this is completely solid. This is a little bit see-through. But this one is very see-through. So now we have different alpha values for different objects that we're drawing by using the alpha value of the diffuse material. You can also just use a specific opacity value, where you can take the opacity from the file, for instance. If we now go into mesh model here and we go ahead and we say we are going to material diffuse is going to be red, green, blue, And instead of 1 here, we're going to say this is going to be part.material.opacity. So we're going to set that as the alpha value. Okay, we're not drawing any object, so let's go in here and draw the object instead. So model.draw. So okay. So we have depth testing here, which is why this disappears like that. So I'm guessing the opacity is 0 now on the materials. So let's just go into the test model file here and add opacity. Or actually what I'd like to do first is to go into mesh model. Oh, let's go into material here. Okay, opacity is 1 default. I'm wondering if it actually ends up set to 0 anyway. So let's go into the model file itself. Test model. Okay, let's just take the same way as shininess here. Say opacity will now be, well, let's just start with 1.0. Add that same thing here to the other material. See if this, yes, now I've got something. Now I'm going to take this second material here, the yellow-green one. I'm going to say those are going to be kind of see-through. So the big sphere here is not see-through, but the little ones are. Again, the order in which we draw the polygons can affect this. So we can see there are some artifacts here, and the only way to fix them is to actually order the index list so that it draws the polygons from farthest to nearest in order for this to be completely right. But we can see that this is affecting the entire thing, so we can have the other way around, say this is fairly strong, whereas the other one has an opacity of 0.2 or something. See how this turns out. Okay, this becomes just really, really dark. But we can't see the yellow ones themselves through it because the big one is drawn first. So we have to kind of be careful when we're working with this kind of transparency. But it's fun to play around with. You just have to make sure that you draw the polygons and the objects in the right order. So transparent objects drawn last, always. Okay, now we have blending turned on. Another thing that we wanted to do, or wanted to be able to do, was to be able to take the, if we go into our shader, is to have another type of texture. So we've already seen in another lecture where we have a specularity texture as well. Now I'm going to see if I can take these texture, the diffuse texture, and double that and make a opacity texture, basically an alpha texture. I'm actually going to make it just with a full color and then just use one part of the color, but you can optimize that if you want. Let's just make this simple for now. So okay, uses diffuse texture, uses diffuse texture location, and diffuse texture location. Let's make these same ones, except for, let's call it alpha texture. This alpha texture location. Okay, let's see where we're setting these. So we're gonna have to make variables then in the shader as well. Just trust we'll do that. Like so. Okay. I'm gonna take this here and say, call this set alpha texture. Alpha texture. So this doesn't really matter here. Okay. So use alpha texture, set alpha texture, and I'm going to take the uses textures function here and say this, or this is alpha texture. If either one of them is true, this is true, and so we use the UV map. Oops. Okay, so now we have this. Basically just double this function, set it to use alpha texture instead. Now we're actually gonna go into our shader and say, so we don't need a new set of UV mapping. We just use the same UV mapping. But what we're gonna need is another one of these. Uses alpha texture, and we're going to need another texture sampler called alpha texture. Since we're using material diffuse.a here, let's just go ahead and say like this: if uses alpha texture, then we're going to say material diffuse.a equals texture duty alpha texture on those UVs. Dot, we can use any color from that. Choose the red color. So I'm going to use a 24-bit color to represent this. And we don't need the else. We can actually say otherwise it'll just be set to 1. I guess it's 1 by default, but let's make sure. Alright, so now we're sampling from this texture using the same UV map, and we're sending that into the alpha. I'm not sure how this will work out now, or if everything will compile. Yes, the shaders compile at least. Okay. Now I want to go to the game here, and I want to draw the sphere again. Okay, everything's solid, everything's nice. Everything should be blending here, except everything has the alpha value 1, I believe. No, wait, I shouldn't have done that earlier, definitely not. Here, I shouldn't do this else here, because then we're overriding the actual diffuse value of the, no, the alpha value of the diffuse material. Okay, so we have some transparency here. Now the transparency texture can be used to basically make holes or whatever into what we have there. So I'm simply going to just open GIMP here. New file, 512 by 512, whole powers of 2. Then I'm going to go ahead and make all of this white, except let's take a brush, bigger brush, not that big, something like that. Make pockets of zeros here. Of course, I'm not setting this up to work as a spherical UV map, but we'll see what this looks like. Let's save it, or actually export. Export as here, and just call it map 1 PNG. Export. Fine. Okay, now I'm going to grab that, stick it into here, my textures, alpha map 1. Okay, now we have to go into the game. We have to say, to make basically another texture here. So we're still going to use that texture, and add another which we just call alpha text. And we'll say alpha text equals this blah blah blah, alpha map 01.png. Okay, so we're loading this texture. Now we need some way of actually sending it into sphere graphic here. Sphere graphic, let's just say texture alpha text, and go and say shader.set alpha texture alpha text. So that should do the trick. So we're setting this alpha texture in the textures here. That actually means that we're going to have to, anywhere else, like let's go into mesh model and make sure we're setting diffuse texture to null and the alpha texture to null, otherwise we're going to end up inadvertently using an alpha texture that we never set to this. And for now, in box graphic, well, we can actually add the whole thing to box graphic as well. Let's say alpha text. So we'll just add the alpha texture here and add this here as well. Okay, that'll give us errors here, and we can just say, to begin with, we can just say null and make sure that everything compiles here as well. More errors. Null, null. Okay, in the pyramids. Okay, so the pyramids are drawing correctly, no alpha texture. Okay, so now I'm going to go up here, and we're going to draw this with alpha text. Okay, so this is being set here. The texture itself is being overwritten as well. Texture here. Aha, I know what this is. So in our shader class, we are binding to the same texture unit. We have to make sure that each texture that we're going to use at the same time is bound to a different texture unit. So now we should be able to use both at the same time. So it's see-through, but we have the other texture there as well. However, this is being drawn first. So if we switch now, go into the game again, and draw the pyramids before we draw all this here. Oh, actually before we set the material for this as well. Here, we draw the pyramids. Alright, then we can see that this is actually being drawn through. But this is kind of weird in this case. So even though we're drawing something transparent and using blending, we're still setting the depth value. There's one way of actually not setting the depth value. Let's move the pyramids down here as well. Again, we're drawing the pyramids afterwards, meaning that we're setting a depth value, so it's transparent, it's being blended to the background, but it's drawn before the pyramid. So when the pyramid is behind it, it doesn't blend through because the pyramid hasn't been drawn yet when the sphere is drawn. But there's another way to set this. If we go in here, we can just do an alpha test. So go here after we set the material and everything. We can just go and say if material diffuse.alpha is less than 0.1, say discard. Discard means take this fragment that we're drawing now and throw it away. There won't be a color won't be put in the frame buffer, and a color won't be put, or a depth value won't be put in the depth buffer. So then suddenly we have these actual holes in this. So the edges here are being blended, but where we're very low on the alpha, where it's almost not there, we simply throw it away. So we don't have to do all the lighting calculations and all that. We just throw it away, and the entire thing is see-through, like we see here. So you can play around with these ideas, checking the alpha value and just discarding, or setting a low alpha. So I don't know if we actually need this now, since it's part of the material diffuse at this point. No, we do. So it's not being added automatically in there. So we're going to make sure that it's added anyway. We set the frag color alpha to the value we need. So play around with these values. Here we're reading alpha values from a texture. We're using alpha to blend. We're also using alpha simply to check discard values. So it made these holes here without blending. And what we could do now is we can actually go ahead and we can take the blending part. Just comment that out again. So we're not blending, but the alpha test is still working. So these holes are still doing what they're supposed to do. Obviously the lighting works weirdly on the inside of this, but go ahead and play around with this. And this is just one way to set whatever value you want to a texture. So I use the texture now to set the alpha. I can do the same thing and use it to set the specularity. You can actually just go ahead and do that in the shader and say, alright, I'm going to change this, and instead of this code here, I'm going to go ahead and copy this code for specular. Use this specular texture. Say specular diffuse. No, not specular diffuse. Material specular. Material specular. If it uses a specular texture, it should be called specular, but I'm going to call it alpha texture now. I'm going to use the alpha texture now. So alpha texture here. Material specular equals u underscore material specular. So we're now using the alpha texture to read specular values instead. Material for specular will be, well, not this, because we've already set it here. Actually, we can comment this out instead. That's nice. So material specular is using the alpha texture. Not .r, just using the alpha texture. And of course we have to use, if uses alpha texture, so we're using alpha texture here instead of that, and then we're gonna comment this stuff out, and we can just see what happens now. Using the same texture, except suddenly now we're using it as a specular value. So I have the camera now. Can you see how some parts of this are shiny and some aren't? So there's no shine now, there's a shine here. There's no shine now, it's shiny here. So shiny here, not shiny here, shiny here, not shiny, not shiny, shiny. Okay, so now we suddenly have, it looks like it's wet in some places, kind of, because it shines there, but dry in the other places where there's no specularity. So, experiment with this, play around with this. I'm going to set this, just going to undo the stuff I did here. Okay, like so. This doesn't really belong here. And now we have the holes again. Okay, so play around with this. Do whatever you want with textures. Set them to any values you want in your shaders, and you can do a whole lot of interesting things. You can even, if you can figure out a nice way of drawing maps where the red, green, and blue colors represent vectors instead of colors, you can actually set up a vector map and then use those vectors to add on to the vectors, the normal vector that's already there, in order to do the lighting calculation on that. And so you can texture bumps and unevenness and different facings in the surface without actually having to do more polygons. You can still get kind of more detailed polygon and normal data. That would be a bump map or a normal map. So that's it for, I think, using textures for other stuff, looking at both blending and alpha testing, and using the alpha value for different things. Later on we can look at particle effects and such, where we just take a sprite with a texture and blend it onto a lot of different sprites, and then we just basically generate very many sprites that look the same from the same point and distribute them in directions and allow them to move around, and then blend them with each other, and we can make really cool energy effects and fire effects and such with particle effects like that. Just using a textured polygon called a sprite with blending and blending it differently onto other sprites. With regular transparency you can make smoke with kind of a projected lit up GL1 GL1 or GL source alpha GL1, where it's added on to the effect constantly. You can make energy effects which are strongest in the middle and then fade out. And so yeah, a whole lot of things that you can do experimenting with blending and alpha values and different uses for textures in your shaders.